It all began in the warm embrace of our little bookstore, a quaint haven tucked away on a quiet street. The moment you stepped inside, the gentle chime of the bell above the door would announce your arrival, echoing softly against the backdrop of old wooden shelves lined with books that had stories to tell. The air was rich with the scent of fresh paper and ink, mingling with the subtle aroma of coffee from the small nook where we served our customers. It was a sanctuary not just for readers, but for us, Sam and Hannah, partners in both love and life. Hannah had a gift for making everyone feel welcome. Her laughter was like music that filled the aisles, and her passion for literature was contagious. She had this incredible ability to connect with every customer, to pull them into a conversation about the latest bestseller or a forgotten classic. I often marveled at how she could recall the smallest details about our regulars, their favorite authors, their reading preferences, and even their personal stories. It was as if each book was a bridge to understanding their lives, and Hannah was the skilled architect building those connections. Together, we curated the shelves, carefully selecting titles that reflected our eclectic tastes and values. Our little bookstore was a labor of love, a dream we had nurtured together since we first met at a local literary festival. I remember how we spent countless nights huddled over a table, scribbling down ideas for our future shop. Sharing our hopes and ambitions over steaming mugs of tea. We envisioned a space that was more than just a retail store. We wanted it to be a community hub, a place where people could gather to share ideas, engage in spirited discussions, and find solace in the written word. The walls were adorned with framed photographs from our travels, each picture telling a story of its own, moments frozen in time, memories of adventures that had shaped us. There were snapshots from the book fairs we attended in distant cities. Images of quaint cafes where we had lost track of time discussing our favorite novels, and even candid shots of us goofing around behind the counter, reveling in the simple joys of life. Our days flowed seamlessly together. Mornings were spent unpacking new shipments of books, eagerly anticipating the arrival of titles we had long awaited. We would joke about which ones would fly off the shelves and which would gather dust, playfully debating the merits of popular authors versus the hidden gems we loved to promote. By noon, the store would be bustling with customers, and we'd find ourselves in a rhythm, Hannah chatting with visitors while I managed the register and organized the inventory. In the afternoons, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the shop, we would often host small events. Poetry readings, book clubs, and author signings transformed our cozy space into a vibrant gathering spot. Each event was an opportunity to engage with our community, share our passion for literature, and foster connections among fellow book lovers. We would sit side by side, hands intertwined, exchanging glances filled with unspoken understanding as we listened to local poets share their work or watched children's eyes light up during story time. As the day drew to a close, we would often linger in the shop, basking in the soft glow of the reading lamps, and sharing our thoughts on the day's events. It was during these quiet moments that we would reflect on our dreams for the future, discussing the possibility of expanding our little store or even writing our books someday. The world felt limitless, and so did our love for each other. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence lay a tension I could never quite pinpoint. Hannah seemed to grow distant at times, her laughter sometimes tinged with a hint of melancholy. I chalked it up to the stress of running a business, of balancing our dreams with the realities of life. Yet, there was an undeniable shift, an elusive something that nagged at me, whispering doubts I didn't want to acknowledge. Looking back now, I realized that those moments were the calm before the storm, a foreshadowing of the unraveling that would soon come. Our cozy bookstore, once a symbol of our love and shared dreams, would soon become the backdrop for betrayal and heartbreak, a stage where the story of our lives took a dramatic turn. Little did I know, the warmth that once enveloped us was about to be pierced by a chilling revelation, forever changing the course of our lives together. As the seasons shifted and autumn settled over our quaint town, I found myself caught in a web of small, nagging details that began to unravel the fabric of our seemingly perfect life. The leaves outside turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, and while the world around us transformed into a canvas of beauty, within our bookstore, something felt unsettling. It started as a whisper, a faint echo of doubt that lingered at the back of my mind, gradually growing louder until it became impossible to ignore. Hannah, once so full of light and warmth, began to change. I first noticed it during our morning routines. The days had grown shorter, and as the sunlight crept later into the morning, I watched her move through our home in a haze, her usually bright smile replaced by a distracted expression. She seemed preoccupied, her thoughts drifting far away as she prepared for work. Mornings that were once filled with laughter and shared plans became quiet, punctuated only by the sound of her hurried footsteps and the rustling of papers. The little conversations we used to share over breakfast dwindled, replaced by a heavy silence that settled like a fog over us. As I glanced at the clock one evening, I found myself anxiously waiting for her return from the store. The hours stretched endlessly, the familiar tick-tock of the wall clock growing louder in the stillness of our home. Hannah had always been diligent, often the first to arrive and the last to leave our bookstore, her dedication to our shared dream evident in her every action. But now, it seemed she was coming home later and later, each night blurring into the next. I told myself it was just the busy season, perhaps a new shipment of books or a particularly demanding customer. Yet, as I waited, a sense of unease washed over me. When she finally walked through the door, I noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She would enter with a forced smile, her cheeks slightly flushed, as if she had been running from something. I tried to engage her, to draw her into a conversation about the day's events. But she often brushed me off with vague responses. "Oh, it was just a busy day," she'd say, her eyes darting away as if avoiding my gaze. The spark that had once ignited her words seemed dimmed, as if she was holding back pieces of herself I longed to connect with. The moments when she would normally share the latest book discoveries or exciting customer stories vanished. Instead, I found myself piecing together fragments of her days from what little she offered. I learned to read the subtle signs. The way her fingers would fidget with the hem of her shirt, or how she would often glance at her phone as if expecting a message that never came. I began to wonder what secrets lay behind her silence, what stories she was choosing not to share. Even our evenings, once filled with discussions about literature and dreams, turned into awkward pauses filled with unspoken words. I'd sit across from her at the dinner table, the silence heavy between us, a stark contrast to the laughter that had once filled our home. I tried to bridge the gap, asking her about her day, and about the customers she had met, but it felt like I was reaching out to a stranger. Her answers were clipped and unenthusiastic, and I could sense the distance growing, an invisible barrier rising between us. As the weeks rolled on, I found myself growing more attuned to the little changes in her behavior. There were moments when I'd catch her staring out the window, her expression distant and thoughtful. I would wonder what thoughts occupied her mind, what worries pulled her focus away from us. I began to notice the subtle signs, the lingering scent of perfume that was unfamiliar, the faint hint of cologne on her clothes that didn't belong to me. Each detail felt like a stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples of doubt through my heart. Then there were the late-night phone calls. I'd hear her whispering into the receiver, the conversation hushed and secretive. She would retreat to another room, her voice barely above a murmur, and I would sit in the living room, straining to catch snippets of her words, but the specifics eluded me. All I could discern was the warmth in her tone, a tone I had not heard directed at me in a long time. My heart would race with each passing moment, each syllable fueling the fire of my suspicions. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, to push them away like an unwanted shadow. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that the stresses of running the bookstore were simply taking their toll. I longed to believe that Hannah was just going through a phase, that she would return to the vibrant woman I had fallen in love with. But as the days turned into weeks, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me, and I could no longer ignore the growing chasm between us. That autumn, as the wind howled outside and the days grew colder, I found myself standing at the edge of a precipice, peering into the unknown. The little details that once seemed trivial now formed a mosaic of doubt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart ached with a mixture of love and fear, caught in a battle between trust and suspicion. As I stared into the fading light of our cozy bookstore, I couldn't help but wonder, would the warmth of our life together survive the impending storm? It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when the air in our bookstore felt charged with an unsettling tension. The golden sunlight filtered through the large front windows, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor, but despite the picturesque scene, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. That day, we had arranged for a delivery from our regular supplier, John, who had always been a reliable part of our bookstore's lifeblood. But as I prepared for his arrival, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me in recent weeks. When John walked through the door, he was his usual self, charismatic and confident, with an easy smile that seemed to light up the room. He greeted Hannah with a warmth that struck me, an intensity that lingered just a little too long as they exchanged pleasantries. I watched from behind the counter, where I usually felt secure, but today, that familiar sense of comfort was replaced by an icy pang of discomfort. I noticed how Hannah's eyes sparkled as she laughed at one of John's jokes, her laughter ringing out like music in the air, and I felt a wave of jealousy rise within me, threatening to spill over. John began unloading boxes filled with new books, chatting animatedly with Hannah as she eagerly helped him. The way she leaned in, the way her fingers brushed against his as they sorted through the shipments, made my stomach churn. I forced myself to focus on the tasks at hand, checking in the inventory and organizing the shelves, but my mind raced, replaying the scenes unfolding before me like a slow-motion film. Each time John glanced at Hannah, his expression held a glimmer of something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something that felt far too intimate, too familiar. As the afternoon wore on, I caught myself watching them, unable to look away. John would occasionally steal sidelong glances at me, his eyes sparkling with a satisfaction that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt exposed, as if he were reveling in a secret that I was oblivious to, and each shared smile between them felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my heart. The laughter, the playful banter, it all felt like a performance, one in which I was an unwilling audience, confined to a role I had not chosen. At that moment, the bookstore, once our sanctuary, felt like a cage, closing in around me as I stood there, rooted to the spot. I wanted to confront John, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I forced myself to act normal, to be cordial, to maintain the facade of a comfortable partnership. But inside, I was a storm brewing, a tempest of emotions threatening to spill over at any moment. As the meeting came to a close, John waved goodbye with that same disarming smile, the kind that had always made him so likable. But as he stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I felt a mixture of relief and dread wash over me. Hannah returned to my side, her expression animated, and for a fleeting moment, I longed to feel that warmth radiating from her again. But as she started to recount the details of their conversation, I found myself unable to listen, lost in a haze of suspicion and doubt. Later that evening, the weight of the day hung heavily on my shoulders as I met up with my friend Mike at our usual pub, a cozy little place known for its warm atmosphere and the aroma of hearty meals wafting through the air. The pub was bustling with life, laughter echoing off the walls, but I felt like an outsider, my thoughts consumed by the unsettling encounter with John. Sitting across from Mike, I struggled to find the words to articulate the storm brewing within me. He leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowed with concern as he took a sip of his beer, waiting patiently for me to gather my thoughts. Finally, I exhaled deeply, the breath feeling heavy in my chest. "It's about Hannah," I began, my voice low, filled with uncertainty. "I've noticed some things lately, things that just don't feel right." "What do you mean?" Mike asked, his gaze steady, encouraging me to share my worries. I hesitated, grappling with the fear of revealing my suspicions. "She's been distant, coming home late, and then there's John, he seemed too comfortable with her today." "I don't know, maybe I'm just overthinking it," I admitted, my voice trailing off. "Maybe," Mike replied, "but you have to trust your instincts." "Have you talked to her about it?" I shook my head, the knot in my stomach tightening even further. "That's the thing. I want to, but I don't know how. What if I'm wrong? What if I ruin everything over a feeling? Better to talk it out than to let it fester," he said, his voice firm yet understanding. "But I get it. It's never easy. You two have built something special together. Confronting her might feel like you're poking a bear." I hesitated again, unsure of how to voice my fears. I don't want to come across as paranoid or insecure. What if I make things worse? What if I lose her? Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his expression softening. "You won't know until you ask her. You deserve clarity, man. If something is going on, don't you want to know? It's better to face the truth than to live in doubt." His words resonated within me, echoing my internal struggle. I knew he was right. The longer I waited, the more the doubt would gnaw at me, consuming my thoughts. Yet, the thought of confronting Hannah made my heart race with anxiety. I had always believed that honesty was the foundation of our relationship, But now I felt trapped between that belief and the fear of what the truth might reveal. As the evening wore on, I tried to enjoy the camaraderie of my friend, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the brink of something monumental, something that could shatter the illusion of our life together. The laughter and clinking of glasses around me faded into a dull hum as I sat, lost in thought, pondering the difficult conversation that awaited me. Finally, as I walked home that night, the cool breeze against my skin felt sharp and invigorating, yet my heart was heavy with uncertainty. The weight of my suspicions pressed down on me like a lead blanket, and I knew that the time to confront Hannah was drawing near. But as I approached our cozy bookstore, the familiar facade that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to loom over me like an ominous shadow, hinting at the revelations that awaited just beyond the door. The evening air was crisp as I made my way to the bookstore, the sun setting slowly behind the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the street. I had planned to pick up a few new titles for our display and was looking forward to spending some quality time with Hannah after a long day. But as I approached the shop, a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The comforting familiarity of our bookstore, once my refuge, now felt charged with a tension I couldn't quite place. As I stepped through the door, the familiar chime echoed in the quiet space, but instead of the comforting scent of books and coffee, I was met with an unusual silence that hung heavily in the air. The dim light from the reading lamps cast long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, I stood there, feeling a chill creep up my spine. It was too quiet, too still, like the calm before a storm. I called out, "Hannah?" But my voice felt weak in the emptiness of the store. My heart began to race as I walked further in, glancing toward the back room where we kept our inventory. That's when I heard it, a soft, lilting laugh that was unmistakably Hannah's. It echoed from the depths of the store, and an icy pang of dread gripped my heart. Instinctively, I moved toward the sound, the knot in my stomach tightening with each step. The closer I got, the clearer it became that there was more than just the sound of her laughter. I could hear a deep voice responding, its tone smooth and inviting. I froze just outside the doorway, my breath hitching in my throat as I recognized it, John. I hesitated, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to turn back, to retreat and erase this moment, but another part, more primal and fueled by a desperate need for answers, urged me to stay. I peered into the back room, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, and what I saw struck me like a blow. There they were, Hannah and John, standing close together, their bodies almost touching as they sorted through a stack of books. The soft light cast a warm glow around them, but the intimacy of the scene felt cold and sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. Hannah's face was lit with a smile, one that seemed to radiate joy and connection, a stark contrast to the shadows that danced around us. John leaned in slightly, his voice low and conspiratorial, and Hannah responded with a playful grin, her eyes sparkling in a way that made my breath catch. I felt an overwhelming rush of emotions, betrayal, anger, heartbreak, all crashing over me like a wave. My chest constricted painfully, and I could barely comprehend what was happening before me. In that moment, the world around me faded away, leaving only the two of them in sharp focus. The laughter, once a source of warmth, now felt like an echo of betrayal. I watched as John brushed his fingers against Hannah's arm, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of fury through me. The familiarity of their interaction felt like an invasion, a scene that belonged to another world, one where I didn't exist. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick in my lungs as I fought against the rising tide of emotions threatening to engulf me. My heart raced as a wave of nausea washed over me, and I felt my world begin to tilt on its axis. This wasn't just a moment of intimacy, it was a revelation that shattered the illusion of our life together. I took a step back, retreating into the shadows, desperately trying to quell the tempest inside me. I wanted to scream, to confront them right then and there, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer weight of what I had just witnessed. The image of their closeness burned in my mind, etching itself into my memory like a brand. Finally, I turned and fled the store, the door swinging shut behind me with a resounding finality. Outside, the cool evening air hit me like a slap, grounding me in the reality of the moment. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned against the cool brick wall of the building, trying to process what I had just seen. The world around me felt distorted, as if I had stepped into a dream where everything was both familiar and alien. I felt a well of anger rising within me, mingling with heartbreak and disbelief. How could she? How could they? The cozy bookstore that had once been our sanctuary now felt like a prison of secrets and lies, a reminder of the love I thought we had built together. I sank to the ground, my back pressed against the wall, and buried my face in my hands as the weight of the revelation crushed down on me. Hannah's laughter echoed in my ears, mingling with the memory of our shared dreams, and I realized that everything had changed in an instant. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and I knew that the confrontation I had been avoiding would soon become an inescapable reality. I had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. As the night stretched on and the chill of reality seeped into my bones, I found myself wandering the quiet streets, my mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. The initial shock of the betrayal began to ebb, replaced by a simmering anger that burned brighter with every passing moment. I couldn't shake the image of Hannah and John from my mind, their laughter ringing like a taunt in my ears. I was no longer the passive observer of my life. I was determined to take control. It was in that moment of solitude, as I walked through the hushed streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights, that a plan began to take shape in my mind. The anger I felt was palpable. And while part of me wanted to confront Hannah directly, to scream at her and demand answers, I knew deep down that I wouldn't find satisfaction in a physical confrontation. No, I needed a way to expose the truth, to lay bare the depths of her betrayal without resorting to violence. And so, the idea of a poetic evening was born. A poetry night at our bookstore had always been a dream of ours, a way to connect with the community and share our love for literature. But now, I envisioned it as a stage, a platform to air my grievances. To weave my heartbreak and betrayal into verses that would resonate with everyone present. The thought ignited a fire within me. I would use the power of words to expose her, to lay bare the truth in a way that would cut deeper than any accusation. I spent the next few days planning every detail, meticulously crafting the evening's theme. I chose a date when the bookstore would be packed, hoping for a full house, friends, familiar faces, even strangers. I imagined the warm, inviting atmosphere, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the musty aroma of old books. But beneath that inviting facade, I would unleash my pain, my sorrow, and my fury in the form of poetry. As I wrote, I channeled every ounce of betrayal into my verses. I crafted stanzas that captured the essence of deception, the feeling of being blindsided by someone I trusted. My heart ached as I relived the moments of our love, the memories we had built together, only to watch them crumble under the weight of her infidelity. Each word was a cathartic release, a way to transform my anguish into art. When the day of the event arrived, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. The bookstore was filled with friends and regular patrons, the room buzzing with chatter and laughter. I had made sure to keep the atmosphere light and inviting, the perfect setting for the evening I had orchestrated. I welcomed everyone with a smile, greeting them as they settled into their seats, all the while suppressing the tumult of emotions roiling inside me. As the evening began, I took a deep breath and reminded myself that this was not just a performance, it was my truth. I started with light-hearted poems and warm anecdotes about our love for literature and the joy of community. The laughter and applause washed over me like a soothing balm, and I reveled in the shared moments. But deep inside, I felt the anticipation build, the pressure mounting as I prepared to shift the tone of the evening. When I finally transitioned to my more somber verses, the atmosphere began to change. The laughter faded, and a palpable tension filled the room as I recited my words, each line echoing with the pain of betrayal and loss. I poured my heart into every syllable, describing the anguish of feeling deceived and abandoned, the raw emotion of love tainted by betrayal. I could feel the eyes of my audience on me, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern, and I sensed the realization dawning on them. I glanced at Hannah, seated near the front, and the expression on her face shifted from curiosity to horror as the implications of my words began to sink in. Trust is a fragile thing, I recited, my voice steady but filled with emotion. It shatters like glass, leaving jagged edges where love once bloomed. How do you mend a heart that has been pierced by betrayal? The silence in the room grew heavier, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. I could see the discomfort rippling through the crowd as they absorbed the gravity of what I was saying. This was not just a performance, it was a revelation, a confession veiled in poetic lines. As I moved through my verses, detailing the hollow ache of deception and the emptiness it left behind, I noticed how the room had shifted. The warmth that had filled the space at the beginning of the night was now replaced by an uncomfortable tension, as my audience grappled with the truth laid bare before them. I caught glimpses of shared glances, whispers exchanged, and the realization dawning on them that I was speaking not just of abstract concepts but of real feelings. Real betrayals. And then, I looked directly at Hannah, my heart pounding in my chest. Her eyes were wide, filled with shock and fear as she slowly began to understand that this evening was not merely about poetry, it was a reckoning. With one final, gut-wrenching line, I ended my poem. Betrayal is a thief in the night, stealing the joy of love, leaving nothing but shadows behind. The applause that followed felt distant, as if I were hearing it from underwater. My heart raced as I stepped back, my breath coming in shaky gasps. The evening had transformed, and I could sense the realization washing over my audience, the whispers that followed me like a shadow. I had exposed the truth, not through violence but through the raw power of words, leaving Hannah in the center of the storm, vulnerable and unprotected. At that moment, I felt a surge of vindication. I had taken control of my narrative, weaving my pain into art, and now, the truth was out for all to see. As the night unfolded, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation, knowing that the path ahead would be fraught with pain but also with the promise of clarity. I had chosen my weapon carefully, and now it was time to face the consequences. As the final echoes of my poem faded into silence, the weight of the moment settled over the room like a thick, suffocating fog. I stood there, motionless, my pulse thrumming in my ears as I scanned the faces of the audience. At first, there was only stunned stillness. The kind that follows a revelation too shocking to immediately process. People blinked, their eyes wide, exchanging uncertain glances as they absorbed the true meaning behind my words. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving nothing but tension and disbelief hanging in its place. I watched as the realization crept across the faces of those gathered, our friends, our customers, the very people who had known us or thought they had. The warmth and camaraderie that had once filled the bookstore evaporated, replaced by a thick unease. Expressions shifted from confusion to recognition, their features tightening in shock as the subtext of my poem became undeniable. There were no longer veiled metaphors or poetic musings. It was clear that I was speaking about Hannah, about her betrayal, about John. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like the first drops of rain before a storm. A murmur of disbelief passed from person to person, subtle at first, then growing louder as the truth sunk in. The people who had once smiled and shared conversations with us now looked at Hannah with wide eyes, their gazes filled with a mixture of pity, judgment, and shock. I could hear snippets of conversations, words spoken in hushed tones. Is he talking about Hannah? It can't be. Did she really, with John? I can't believe it. I thought they were so happy. The bookstore, once our sanctuary of warmth and connection, had become a stage for public reckoning. I stood there, my chest tight with a whirlwind of emotions. But outwardly calm. I had achieved what I set out to do. The mask of our perfect life had been ripped away, and now the raw truth lay bare for everyone to see. My eyes finally drifted to Hannah. She was sitting near the front, frozen in her chair, her face pale and stricken as the magnitude of the situation unfolded before her. At first, she seemed stunned, as if her mind was struggling to process what had just happened. Her hands, which had been clasped in her lap, now gripped the edges of her seat. Knuckles white, her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. She was trapped, exposed in front of everyone we knew. I could see the flicker of emotions pass across her face, shock, confusion, then the slow, creeping realization that there was no hiding from this. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and I saw the tears welling in her eyes as the full weight of her shame began to settle in. The bookstore, once a place of comfort, had become the scene of her unraveling. And there was no way out. The whispers around us grew louder, and I could hear the soft murmurs of disapproval and shock directed toward Hannah. It was clear that people were beginning to piece together the full story, and the judgment in their voices was unmistakable. I could hear the sharp, accusatory tone of someone whispering, "How could she do that to him?" "To Sam?" followed by the murmurs of agreement from others nearby. Hannah stood up abruptly, her face flushed with shame and panic. She looked at me, her eyes wide, pleading silently for mercy. But I remained where I was, rooted to the spot, my gaze unwavering. This was her moment to face the truth, and I wasn't about to offer her an easy way out. Sam," she stammered, her voice shaky, breaking the silence that had settled over the room like a heavy curtain. "It's not what you think. Please, just let me explain." But her words rang hollow, empty in the face of everything I had just revealed. Her voice wavered, trembling with desperation, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The truth had been spoken, and no amount of excuses or explanations could undo what had been laid bare in front of everyone. "Let you explain?" I finally spoke, my voice low but steady, cutting through the air like a knife. "Explain what, Hannah? That everything we had together was a lie? That you thought I wouldn't notice you slipping away?" I could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but I kept it in check. I had already laid my heart bare through the poetry. I didn't need to yell or scream. The words themselves had been enough, and now I watched as she crumbled under the weight of them. Hannah's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone to come to her defense, but no one moved. The room was filled with stunned silence, the whispers of disapproval replaced by a cold, heavy stillness. There was no one to save her from this, no one to justify what she had done. The reality of her betrayal hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable, suffocating in its intensity. I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible now as if even she no longer believed her excuses. "It wasn't supposed to. But her words trailed off, falling flat in the face of the truth that everyone in the room now understood. I saw the tears welling in her eyes, but there was no sympathy left in me to offer. This was the consequence of her choices, and now she had to face it, just as I had faced the devastating reality of her betrayal. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I echoed, my voice calm but laced with disbelief. "You didn't mean for it to destroy everything we built together? Everything we shared?" I took a deep breath, the pain still fresh in my chest. "You made your choice, Hannah. And now, everyone sees it for what it is." The tension in the room was unbearable. I could feel the eyes of everyone upon us, the collective shock and discomfort rippling through the crowd like a wave. But no one intervened. No one spoke in her defense. Even John, conspicuously absent from the event, wasn't here to stand by her side. She was alone, exposed in front of all those who had once seen her as part of a perfect couple, now staring at her with judgment and disappointment. I could hear more whispers from the crowd, the soft murmur of people condemning her actions, their disbelief and pity palpable. "I never thought she'd do something like this," someone whispered nearby, and I could see the way people began to distance themselves from her, both physically and emotionally. Hannah's shoulders slumped, her head hanging in defeat as the reality of her situation crashed down around her. There were no more words left to say, no more excuses to offer. The truth had been spoken, and now, she was left to face the aftermath of her choices. As I looked at her, standing there, broken and ashamed, I felt a strange sense of closure. This was the end of something, the end of a chapter that I had never imagined would unfold this way. But it was also the beginning of something new, something that, while painful, would ultimately lead me forward. As the room buzzed with the remnants of our confrontation, I turned away, ready to walk out into the night, leaving the wreckage of our lives behind. As the evening came to an end, I stood near the back of the bookstore, watching the last few guests trickle out into the cool night air. The warm glow of the overhead lights, usually comforting and familiar, now felt distant, cold even. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically from when the night began. What had started as a lively gathering full of warmth and camaraderie had turned into a tense, awkward silence. Conversations that had once flowed easily were now stilted, cut short by the unspoken weight of what had transpired. I could still feel the remnants of the tension clinging to the air, but something in me had shifted too. I felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. The words I had spoken, the verses I had written, had poured out of me like a release valve for the anger and sorrow that had consumed me over the past weeks. And while there was no sense of triumph in what I had done, no satisfaction in watching Hannah unravel before our friends and colleagues, I couldn't deny that I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. I watched as Hannah lingered near the front of the bookstore, her face pale, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She hadn't said much since the confrontation. There were no more excuses, No more attempts to explain or justify what she had done. The room had emptied around her, and now, she stood alone, bathed in the dim light, her shoulders hunched in defeat. I could see the shame weighing heavily on her, her posture speaking of regret and guilt. Though she hadn't yet spoken those words aloud. I didn't approach her. There was nothing left to say, nothing that hadn't already been laid bare in front of everyone. The truth, like a jagged piece of glass, had already cut through both of us, leaving wounds that neither of us could heal with a few words. And while part of me wanted to confront her again, to demand answers, to make her admit the full scope of her betrayal, I knew deep down that no explanation could undo the damage that had been done. I turned my attention back to the bookstore. Our bookstore, its familiar shelves and cozy atmosphere now tainted by the events of the evening. The place that had once been a symbol of our shared dreams, our partnership, felt foreign to me now. I couldn't imagine spending another evening here, surrounded by the memories of a life that had been built on lies. The sense of betrayal still gnawed at me, deep and persistent, but there was something else there too, something more subtle but just as powerful. It was the bitter taste of finality, the realization that this chapter of my life was truly over. As I stood there, my mind began to drift toward the future, toward what would come next. Could we ever repair the damage? Could trust, once shattered so completely, ever be rebuilt? The questions swirled in my mind, but I had no answers. In truth, I wasn't sure if I wanted answers. Part of me wanted to move forward, to leave this mess behind and carve out a new path for myself. But another part, quieter but insistent, wondered if Hannah felt the same regret I had seen in her eyes. Could she be truly sorry for what she had done? And even if she was, could I ever forgive her? The bitterness in my chest swelled as I thought of the possibilities. I wasn't sure I could ever look at her the same way again, no matter how much remorse she showed. The cracks in our relationship weren't just surface level, they ran deep, cutting through the very foundation of who we were. And yet, despite everything, there was a small flicker of sadness within me, a pang of loss for what we had been before it all fell apart. We had shared so much, years of love, of dreams, of hopes for the future. And now, all of it lay in ruins at our feet. As the final guest waved goodbye and slipped out the door, I took one last look around the bookstore. It was strange how the place could feel both so familiar and so alien all at once. The books on the shelves, the smell of paper and ink, the soft lighting, it was all still the same. But the meaning behind it had changed. The bookstore had once been a symbol of our shared future, a place where we had poured our hearts and souls. Now, it felt more like a monument to everything we had lost. With a heavy sigh, I grabbed my coat from the hook near the door and slowly made my way toward the exit. My footsteps echoed through the now empty room, each step feeling like a final goodbye to the life we had once shared. I paused for a moment at the threshold, casting one last glance back at Hannah. She hadn't moved, her eyes were downcast, and I could see the shame etched into her expression. But I didn't feel the need to console her or even to speak. This was her burden to bear now, her shame to live with. As I stepped outside into the cool night, the fresh air hit me like a breath of freedom. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling above, as if unaware of the chaos that had unfolded below. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the evening slowly lifting from my chest. The night was quiet, peaceful even, a stark contrast to the turmoil I had left behind in the bookstore. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger that had fueled me for so long had burned itself out, leaving only a quiet emptiness in its place. It wasn't a joyful feeling, but it wasn't despair either. It was simply an ending. As I walked away from the bookstore, my mind drifted back to the questions that still lingered, unanswered. Could trust ever be rebuilt? Could Hannah ever make amends for what she had done? I didn't know. I wasn't sure if I ever would. But in that moment, as I left her with her shame and regret, I realized that it wasn't my responsibility to figure that out, at least not now. For tonight, I had done what I needed to do. I had spoken my truth, exposed the betrayal, and left the rest to unfold as it would. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, faint but steady, that perhaps, just perhaps, I could find a way forward from here. And with that thought, I turned my back on the bookstore and walked into the night, leaving the wreckage of my past behind.